Hey, I'm Steve Call. I'm the dean here at the Graduate School of Journalism, and I just want to welcome those of you who are new to our campus or to our school, and welcome back those of you who are familiar with the World Room and with our school. I think even a lot of our students who only are here for generally for a year have to pay attention to learn about the institution that brings us together tonight. It's sort of an institution within the journalism school that's relatively new, and its formal name is the Ira Lipman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights. And as you can tell from the name, it was created through the inspiration of a late philanthropist named Ira A. Lipman, who Professor Jelani Cobb and I spent a fair amount of time with toward the end of his life as he was conceiving how he wanted his legacy to unfold in journalism. We'll spare you the long story on another occasion. It's worth listening to. But essentially, he was inspired by his experience as a teenager in Little Rock, Arkansas during the desegregation of Central High. He was kind of an accidental witness to history and to journalism, and it inspired him throughout a long career in other areas of business. And when he had wealth to give back, he decided that he wanted to invest in the kind of ethos that he had seen as a teenager. And so he entered into conversation with us about creating this center and endowing a professorship, which we were very fortunate to bring Professor Cobb to fill. So that package of a center with resources to invest in journalism that might not be commercially fundable, but which is often inspiring and always important, as well as a leader and a little bit of time and space to think about where such journalism should go from year to year, is what Ira Lipman has left us with, to our great sort of pride and with a little bit of humility, honoring the strength of his vision. So that's all I wanted to do by way of welcoming you and introducing, kind of framing our conversation tonight. I'll let Professor Cobb introduce our panelists, who are fellows of the center and whose work exemplifies at least our initial idea of how to invest in this sort of journalism that is otherwise underfunded in the media landscape of today. So with that, Professor Cobb.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, really, seriously? I believe we should be participatory here. So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. And thank you, Steve, for that introduction. We are very happy to have you all here. I mean, let's just be honest, we're happy to be around anyone. This is still like an unusual, slightly unusual feeling. And we actually have people from out of town, which is like just showing off now. As Dean Cole mentioned, this is happening under the auspices of the Ira A. Lipman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights. And we're deeply honored to be able to carry on Mr. Lipman's legacy through promoting and helping support journalism that we believe can stand in the breach, that can make a difference on issues of civil and human rights. And through that initiative, we have been able to partner with the Arnold Foundation for our initial set of Arnold Foundation grants and our Arnold Foundation grant recipients who are all here with us this evening. So I will just give a little rundown about how we're going to operate. Then I will introduce our panelists, and then we will jump into our conversation. Because I really hate when the people have those panel discussions and it's like 12 people on stage and people get to say like 2 things and then it's over. We thought that it would be more efficient for us to divide into 2 shorter panels because we have 8 grant recipients with us. And so our first 4 will come up, and then after that we'll have just a quick 5-minute changeover, and then we'll have our second floor set of panelists, and then afterward, there's stuff in the back. You can all, have refreshments and so on. So, with us right now, we have Samantha Michaels, who is a criminal justice reporter at Mother Jones magazine in Berkeley, California. Before joining the magazine in 2014, she worked for 3 years as a reporter and editor in Myanmar and Indonesia. We also have with us Ryan Little, who is a data journalist and the Roy W. Howard Fellow at Mother Jones. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, and elsewhere. He has a master's degree from Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. Go Terps. Failure to Protect, their project is Failure to Protect, which is really jaw-dropping. As many of the projects were. And their project is an examination of laws that often imprison women for life for failing to protect their children from the abuse of their male partners. The women are just about always victims of the same abuse, and Samantha and Ryan's focus is on Oklahoma, which is a state with some of the harshest practices against these abused women, most of whom are poor and black. We also have with us John Archibald, who is a columnist for AL.com and Alabama Media Group. He won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2018. He was a Neiman Fellow and author of Shaking the Gates of Hell, one of NPR's favorite books of 2021 about family, civil rights, and finding voice. Ashley Remkus is an investigative reporter minding the public's business, I like that, in her home state of Alabama. She is part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 2021. I have family in Alabama. My maternal side of my family is from Alabama. I was telling John and Ashley that their reporting on their project, which I'll read about in a little bit, just made it certain that I was not going back to Alabama anytime soon. People might have gotten word that I was somehow connected to this. I was like, nope, not going back down there. Aggressive policing in an Alabama town that affects poor, largely black residents. Revenge by a white police officer and his department in the same town against a black pastor who filed a complaint against them for malicious prosecution. Again, jaw-dropping. And interestingly enough, as those pieces began circulating around, I started getting them back from people who didn't know that I was connected in any way to the reporting, which I thought was a great indicator of just how significant these stories have been. And they can come up, I will read, actually I'll give you everyone now, and I'll reiterate. Our next, after them will be, the next set will be Pulitzer Prize winning Associated Press reporters Margie Mason and Robin McDowell, who've spent most of their careers together investigating human rights abuses in vulnerable populations. Their 2015 series with 2 other journalists linking slavery in Southeast Asia's fishing industry to the supply chains of companies like Walmart and Kroger led to more than 2,000 captive men being rescued. Laws were changed, arrests were made, and reforms were launched. They won the Pulitzer Prize for public service and more than 24 other awards. And their project is The Farm, investigating the agricultural supply chain from prison plantations to America's plates. And in addition, in this conversation, that second conversation, Brittney Martin, who is an independent journalist who's based in Houston. She's an experienced investigative reporter, researcher, and long-form narrative writer. She was a member of the Dallas Morning News staff, named in the 2017 Pulitzer Prize finalist for breaking news reporting, and she frequently contributes to the Washington Post and Texas Monthly. Her project, Sugarland, a podcast miniseries exploring the history of convict leasing and the racist beginnings of the Texas penitentiary system through the lens of a parcel of land in Sugarland and the 95 people found buried there. Again, a really astounding story that we were just captivated by from the first time we read that proposal. And we also have with us Julieta Martinelli, who is an award-winning investigative reporter and currently producer at large for Latino USA and Futuro Media. She's a producer of Suave, a narrative podcast about the 30-year-long relationship between a journalist and a juvenile sentenced to die in prison. As a Soros Justice Media Fellow, she spent 2019 documenting the human repercussions of changing legal policies along the U.S.-Mexico border. And her project is the Forgotten Juvenile Lifers of Tennessee, a series of multimedia reports on the legal system's treatment of juvenile lifers in Tennessee, and the majority of whom are Black and low income. And so if our first four panelists would come up, we can start our discussion.
Hi.
Hello.
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 All right, there it is. Can you hear me? All right, everyone's mic is good? Okay, so let's just start with the basic fundamental question. How did you all come to the stories that you proposed for our Arnold Foundation grant process? If we can start on the far end and work our way up.
That's a question for you, not me.
I got interested in failure to protect in 2019. I read an article about a woman named Tondaleo Hall who had just gotten a commutation. She was going to be released from prison, and I was reading about her case, and she had gotten a 30-year prison sentence because her boyfriend had broken one of her children's legs, and her boyfriend only served 2 years in jail, so it was very, very disproportionate. And she was sentenced for failure to protect because she wasn't able to stop the abuse herself. And I was just outraged when I read this story. I couldn't, imagine that something like this happened. And at the end of the story, she was in Oklahoma. At the end of the story, it mentioned that, there might be 14 other people in the state who had been, given similar sentences. And that outraged me even more. And so I called up someone from the ACLU and I started talking with her. And she suggested that it was even more than 14. And so that really piqued my interest. And I decided I wanted to do a bigger investigation. And it turns out there are way more cases than 14. But that's what kind of, brought me onto the path of the story.
I guess. Well, first of all, I didn't write the proposal. I had been on a fellowship, and I came back, and the person who had written the proposal got a job at the LA Times. And I was thinking, what am I going to do now that I come back? And they say, well, why don't you look at criminalization of poverty? And so I started casting around to try to quantify that in a way that people care about, which is a little difficult because we all know the toll that fines and fees and forfeitures play on a lot of people who are at least able to pay for it. And a lot of those stories have been written, and a lot of them amounted to nothing because people have a difficult time trying to see themselves in that position. And so, but everywhere I went and talked to people, people would say, you need to look at this little town of Brookside, which, is 20 miles from my house and I'd barely ever heard of. It's 1,200 people, which is incidentally a quarter of the size of the fictional town of Mayberry. But when I started looking at...
How do you actually know the size of the town Mayberry?
Well, there's this thing called Google, and it'll tell you anything. So I should say that Google says it's a quarter of the size of the town. But anyway, began looking at that and found audits for the town that indicated that in a 2-year period between 2018 and 2020, its revenue from fines and fees had grown 640% to the point where it was using that money, fines and forfeitures, for 49% of the city budget, town budget. And, that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you say, I got something here. And the rest is still going on.
Yeah. Can you talk to me a little bit about, because we are a journalism school and like many of my students are here and many of other students are in the audience, can you talk about the approach you took to reporting these stories and just kind of how you went about gathering the information that went into your pieces? And we'll start in this direction and go back down the other way.
Well, it started again, like I said, when people said, look, we're not sure what's going on, but something's going on. And then, you make the rounds talking to lawyers and public defenders and that sort of thing. Look at lawsuits. And honestly, the whole thing, the Rosetta Stone, as it were, was in a lawsuit because a lawyer had filed depositions with the police chief and audits from the last 5 years. And so I took those audits out and put them in a spreadsheet, and, when the numbers popped, they popped. And so, and then just doing the basic research, going to court, talking to people, seeing the fact that they had a military tank parked outside of their court on days that they had court, talking to people who described how they were pulled over and over again for not having a tag light, driving in the left lane, and when they were pulled over, the story just began to repeat. When they would be pulled over, detained, handcuffed, and the police would bring a dog, their drug-sniffing dog named Canine Cash, to search the car while they were being detained, and then they would show up for court with 12 misdemeanor charges against them. If you were arrested for if you say you had a joint in a baggie in your car, you would be arrested and charged with possession of marijuana, possession of paraphernalia for the paper that wrapped the joint, possession of paraphernalia for the baggie, possession of marijuana in one case for a surface that might have once been used to roll a joint, and it would go on and on and on to the point where they were charging people for that joint like $12,000 in fines. And anyway, that's not the answer to your question, though. But going out, the key, of course, was going out and saying to court, and the police chief who had been avoiding me came out to make sure, because I was talking to people who were going to court. And so he sat down, and I said, hey, this is a 640% increase. It's half your budget. And he said, that's not enough. It should be more.
Wow.
And so when, again, the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you say, I've got something here, and together it all just came together.
I'll just add, too, that you might see me nodding while John's talking. The mayor of this town nodded, if I recall, while the police chief was saying that the 640% increase in fines was not enough, but that it was a positive story. And I think one of the things that was really powerful with this reporting was the number of real people that we heard from. I think it gave a voice. We're not just hearing from the police and the lawyers and the folks who were working within the system, but really hearing from a lot of average people, if you will, people who had lived through this, people who had just been passing through this town. We talked to some guys who were going on a hunting trip who were from Oklahoma, just people passing through this town who found themselves in jail over a minor traffic stop and potentially owing thousands of dollars, their guns, their cell phones, their cars towed or seized, people who had their homes seized from them and just not given back by the police. And so I think those were really powerful stories that in some ways allowed our audience to connect in a way of, this could happen to me if I was just passing through a town like this.
Can you talk a little bit more about, wasn't there even just a kind of manpower crisis, for the police and being able to give out this many tickets and citations?
Well, first of all, when they started in 2018, it was a one-man police force. After we wrote this story, it was a 14-man police force. And I say man because it was men. And now it's down to 4, I think. But the police chief, but the thing that we're working on now is the bottom line, and there's a lot of great horror stories about this that if we had more time, I would regale you with. But the bottom line is, the federal government through the highway department and state funding that funds overtime for police officers, who, by the way, were being paid $12 an hour to go out but they were working all this overtime in order to ticket people, in order to support their entire town. So in my view, it's state sanctioned government-sanctioned speed trap that allowed this to happen. Not to mention the fact that, this town of 1,253 people had, 4 pieces of military surplus equipment, including that tank, which they used to intimidate people, and all that. There've been a lot of results, which is really rewarding.
Yeah. I want to come back to that in a second. Can you talk about the same question? Yeah.
Sure, the approach. Sure, so I'll talk about the narrative side, and then Ryan has done all of our data work, so he can talk about that aspect. So in talking with experts, I knew that these failure to protect prosecutions were happening in just about every single state, but we really wanted to focus on Oklahoma because they were especially common in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is one of several states where you can get life in prison as a woman for this crime. And so we started looking at Oklahoma, and I really wanted to build a narrative around, one family's story. And so I started looking for different cases. I connected with a woman who had received a 30-year prison sentence and started talking with her about her story. She had been in an abusive relationship with her boyfriend who abused her 4-year-old daughter, and she actually, the mother had, thrown herself over her daughter, trying to protect her as the boyfriend was trying to hit her daughter. But ultimately, she wasn't able to save her daughter from the abuse. And so, as I said, she got 30 years in prison. Her boyfriend got 18 years. So it was really disproportionate. And so I built the narrative around her case. She went to trial. It was a really, really ugly prosecution. There was very little sympathy, basically no sympathy paid to the years of abuse that she herself had experienced. And her kids, actually, it's pretty common where, the mother ends up going to prison, and then what happens to the children? They go into foster care, or they go to another abusive guardian. And so in her case, her children went to her ex-husband, different than the boyfriend. But the ex-husband had been in prison recently for abusing them. He had shot up their house with an AK-47 when the children were inside. And in her trial, the prosecutor actually brought up repeatedly, you lived with this abusive ex-husband, you didn't protect your kids from that abuse, you're such a bad mother. But then the state sends the children to him to live with him. So we really wanted to focus on her story, but we also wanted to give a sense of scale, how many cases like this are there? And I talked with experts, attorneys who focus on this area of law around the country, who said that, it's really bad in Oklahoma, but it happens just about everywhere. You can see cases just about every week. It's really common, and Ryan can talk about more about how common it is and what kind of data work he did.
Sure. So we wanted to understand what was happening in this criminal justice system and understand the structure. There had been some great data projects that had been done by others. BuzzFeed had sort of attempted to quantify this problem by making public records requests to departments of correction. The ACLU had done a scraping project of the state of Oklahoma, one of the state of Oklahoma's court websites, and then public record requested all of the affidavits and read the affidavits, and were able to find a lot of cases. I think it was like 48 cases that were sort of similar to what Sam described. But I wanted to get to the structure of that, so we scraped the first website, which is supposed to include all data from all 77 counties, but really only includes about 13. Then we scraped their second court website, which includes data for the other 70 missing, I guess that would be 64 cases. Altogether, we scraped 1.5 million criminal felony and criminal misdemeanor cases. To give you an idea how big of a data project that is, it takes my i9 Gen 9 Pentium core processor about 3 days to parse that data into a SQL database. And ultimately, we've been able to find 900 failure to protect enabling child abuse or enabling child sex abuse cases. And of those, that's 600 people. And because of some of the difficulties in accessing quality structured data at scale, and then the different quality of data available between the two websites, there are about 250 cases where we can say with certainty that they are in fact failure to protect cases. And structurally, we've been able to show that these cases are in fact predominantly charged against women of color. Every other child abuse statute, I've sort of been referring to it as first-hand child abuse, although I'm not sure that that is a great way to explain it, is all predominantly male. Failure to protect is the only charge that is predominantly female in our data set. And in fact, it's more than 2 to 1 male for every other type of child abuse, but for failure to protect, it's more than 3 to 1 male, or 3 to 1 female, excuse me.
Can you talk a little bit about, we'll start with Ryan and come back in this direction. Can you talk a little bit about the obstacles, you just mentioned one, but the obstacles that you confronted, the most difficult thing about approaching the story, whether that was logistical or technical or any other kind of obstacle that you confronted and how you got around it?
Sure. There's been a lot of technical challenges, scraping and analyzing court records for one county alone can be exceptionally difficult, much less 77 counties. Just going back to like the first step, I've been working on this for months while I work on other projects. And so, I was either lazy or efficient whenever I wrote the first scraper that just was using a request library I'd already was able to use some past work to sort of discover the universe of cases, and then just wrote a really simple, like 5 lines of code to just start grabbing every case details page with requests. And that worked for about 100,000 cases until the webmaster banned me and required me, they required me to start submitting headers that basically told them like what kind of browser I am and information about that. And I was trying to fix this really quickly while I was working on something else, so I just copied and pasted some stuff from Stack Overflow, and it started running again, so it was good for about another 100,000 cases. And then ultimately I ended up having to use a Python project called User Agent, which actually uses real-time user statistics based off what kind of browsers people use, and all the way down to like what version, like if it's 97 or if it's 98. And that got me going for about 400,000 cases until they banned my IP. And then luckily I had Verizon Fios, and it's pretty easy to get a new IP. But you always sort of end up fighting with things like that. We also scraped the Department of Corrections offender database. It's a database of about 304,000 people who have served prison time in Oklahoma. And I was able to use like Soundex to overcome this. This was a fun trick I'm very proud of. So Soundex is a known algorithm that turns any string of letters into a sound. So it would, make Smith sound like a last name that sounds like Smith, I guess. And I was able to determine that there were only 4,095 different Soundex codes that would encompass my entire database of the 1.9 million people who show up in those, or the 1.5 million people who show up in those cases. And I was able to save us a lot of money in paying for CAPTCHA solves, which was really nice.
I'm not sure exactly what all that means, but it sounds really deep.
Well,
it sounds really impressive.
I'm happy to answer questions at any point. So.
I ran into a lot of challenges as well with the narrative side. So I guess the first basic challenge was just a lot of women that have been sentenced to prison for these offenses have been traumatized, and they don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about it and reliving their trauma. So that was the first challenge. I think a second challenge is that in this case, we really wanted to connect with the children and get a sense of how this experience had affected them. And it was challenging because the children are now living with that abusive ex-husband. And so initially he was down to help us with the piece, but then, at one point he got really angry at the woman in prison. Her name is Carrie. He got really angry at Carrie and decided that he was no longer going to help us. And so there was a lot of back and forth where our access was kind of being pulled away because their relationship is so fraught. So that was another challenge. A third challenge was access to Carrie and access to the prison. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections has been very difficult to work with. They have a system in place where you can theoretically apply to go in as media, to bring camera. We're making a short documentary about this. And we filled out that application, and we're basically told that, the spokesperson said, we get hundreds of these applications all the time, and so if we accept one person and allow them to come in, we have to accept everyone, and so therefore we accept no one, which was quite frustrating to hear. They put me through months and months of, ring around, and they said, try to come in as a visitor with visitation. You can't bring in any equipment or even a pen and paper, but you can at least meet her. They really dragged along that process, took several months, wouldn't approve me while I was in Oklahoma. About a month after I returned back to California, they finally said that I had been approved to visit. Now I'm trying actually to go visit after this trip, and it's been a nightmare. I don't even think I'm going to be able to go. So that has been another big challenge. And just the last challenge I want to mention, it also has to do with data. It's really hard to find out how common these cases are, because a lot of times when you look at the court records, it doesn't say something like failure to protect or permitting abuse. It just says child abuse. So the woman is put in prison and it just says child abuse, or it just says murder, even though she did not murder her daughter. It says that it was murder. And so it's really hard, if you're looking nationally, to try to figure out how many cases there are. It's very difficult to do that.
And if I can just piggyback on what she's saying, to give you an idea, those 900 cases that we've found, they all say that they are some form of enabling, permitting, or child abuse or failure to protect. But whenever you look at the subsection of the statute that they're actually being charged with, oftentimes they're charging, like the way the statute is written is like A will be child abuse and B will be enabling child abuse, and then different types of it. And so what they're often doing is charging AB. They're charging CD at the same time, and it makes it really hard for us to be able to tell what is actually happening. And that's why we go from 600 people that we know have been charged with this according to the filed text, but only 250 people where we can be certain.
Well, this is a good problem to have, but I think one of our biggest struggles has been sort of moving on from day-to-day coverage of this one town, Brookside, and trying to move in to look at this as a more systemic problem across Alabama. Mm-hmm. It's a good problem in that one of the reasons the news keeps happening is because there's more fallout, there's changes. We're seeing a lot of, things happen as a result of this reporting. But I think we really want to take this beyond just looking at this one town and look at how this issue, this policing for profit, essentially is going on all across the state, and not just in Alabama, across the nation as well. We're getting there. I think we're eagerly publishing a couple Brookside stories when we get back to Alabama, and then really shifting our focus onto some data that we've gathered from other areas across the state.
I'm glad you said that, because that actually anticipated my next question, because like I said, my family history is in Alabama, and I know someone that's happened to in Dothan, the same sort of setup, or like other places around the state. And then even outside Alabama, the bigger context of communities that are too small to actually afford a police department, and that the departments function like an army that's been cut off from its supply lines, feeding themselves on what they find. And that's a really interesting point. John, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about obstacles or difficulties.
The problem in Alabama, and I think most places, and this is not unique to Alabama, we like to think that we have all the problems, but now we know that that's not true. Now we know that everybody has some. But the problem is we don't choose to fund our government well enough to run a government. Mm-hmm. And so the smaller these departments are, number one, the more secretive they are, which makes it difficult to penetrate. But it also, the more reliant their communities become on fines and fees, and so they really militarize themselves. And we've identified, 6 or 7 that are equally as bad as Brookside, if perhaps not as mean or as egregious or ham-handed about it. But the goal is to be able to determine, to be able to show. I mean, the thing about Brookside was people all over the world really became outraged by what happened, and people began to find their voice to talk about it in ways that was great. But as long as you look at Brookside as the problem, then you miss the real problem completely. And there are a lot more sophisticated departments, a lot larger departments who do exactly the same thing in ways that don't appear so egregious, and the numbers don't pop off the page. So our challenge now is to take people's fascination and interest and outrage about this tiny little town and convince them and show them that the same thing is happening to people in their communities. And that's we're really happy with what happened there, because a lot of charges were dropped and and laws were passed or they're in the process of being passed, sponsored by both Republicans and Democrats, which in Alabama is unheard of, and almost anywhere is unheard of right now. And so there's a lot of momentum there, but until we can show that this is much bigger than that in a way that's equally as compelling, I hope, then we're not done.
And I'll just add too, I think you kind of made this point. In Brookside, and we kind of suspect elsewhere, we're working on that, but in Brookside, the people who live there, they weren't getting parks or paved streets. They weren't getting additional services. All of the money essentially went back into the police department.
Wow.
It was one officer to up to 14 at its height. So all of the money was literally just being poured back into the machine that was bringing in the money. And what didn't go to the police went to the court, the prosecutor, the judge, who works there in town part-time. So the people of this town, even if there was somebody there who wasn't necessarily victimized by this, they weren't benefiting from it. They were simply getting more police to write more tickets, pull over more people, stack more charges, more people into the courtroom, police officers outside the courtroom having to direct traffic because so many folks were there for court. So it's just, that's another important point here, is that it was all being poured back into the machine that was bringing in the money to start with.
Before we switch over for the next panel, before we wrap up, I want to make sure that people have a couple minutes to ask some questions. So what we're going to do is we'll do like an abbreviated Q&A here. And then we'll do a kind of round robin with everyone at the end, in case you don't get to ask something now.
Hi. First of all, I can talk loud now. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. First of all, you have an inordinate number of Alabamians here, born in Anniston. My boss in the back is also from there. It's kind of a freakish collection. First of all, I want to say that the word...
But do you put sugar in your grits? That's the most important question here.
Are you high?
Yes, all right. We are people. Then we are people. If you put sugar in your grits, we couldn't talk.
What about cornbread, though?
If there was supposed to have sugar in it, we would call it cake.
So, anyone who has Alabama relationships or is descended from Alabama can stay. The rest of you are welcome to go now.
Anyway, first of all, I just want to say that the work I've seen out of AL.com for the last several years has just been extraordinary. It makes me want to cry. You're doing God's work in a state where you need so much sunshine as antiseptic. So thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
One of the questions I had, you started to talk about the changes that have come. So that was one question I wanted to ask. I'm kind of surprised, frankly, because my little bit of experience on there, and I've never worked as a reporter there, but I'm touching on a project now that has its fingers in it. And in my experience, the authorities really have their backs up and will use anything and everything they can to
I have thoughts. You want to start with your thoughts?
How about we talk after?
Yeah, I mean, Alabama public records law, I mean, is horrible, and it imposes no time limit on how anybody has to respond. So, which means never, too often. So we got lucky, I think, because the chief had been able to lie to everybody before, and he didn't bother. He's one of those guys that didn't think it was important to think enough about his lie because everybody would just believe him. So as soon as he started opening his mouth, then everything unraveled because it was clearly untrue, and people would respond to that. I mean, but again, I think the only reason he ever talked to me was because I was out talking to defendants and that sort of thing. But you talked about the biggest shock to me was the fact that it had resonance among leadership on both sides of the aisle. And in the wake of it all, I mean, there were like 4 bills passed. The lieutenant governor called for an investigation. The town hired an investigator who came back with an initial report who said that, that the police department preyed on people that looked like they couldn't defend themselves, whether they be poor, whether they be people of color, driving vehicles that these officers didn't think that they should be able to afford. This is from their own investigator, whether they were people who had past run-ins with the law, which made them feel vulnerable. And all that led to 13 different lawsuits, 12 different lawsuits, or one for every 94 people in the town of Brookside. So
I love data now.
So yeah. So more than 100 charges, all the felony drug cases out of there that went to county court have been dismissed by the district attorney, and a judge has thrown out all the cases on appeal and as somebody who's done this a long time and has reveled in the fact that, when we get somebody fired or when we get somebody kicked out of office or indicted, or we used to take great joy in that, not that we don't anymore, but there's nothing like the feeling of seeing somebody who is getting railroaded by the police not just get their voice, but to get their freedom from it. And that's, that it gives sense. I mean, I'm sorry, it gives me chills to think about it. And that's what we do this for.
Have you heard from any of the people who were kind of ensnared in that system after the story started running?
Yeah, one of the police officers who called me up the other day and told me I was his only friend. He no longer has a job, but I'm his only friend somehow. No, I mean, a lot of them went, I mean, we had, a lot of people got fired. A lot of the police officers had troubled past. They were brought in by this leader who sort of had dominion over them because they had trouble past. I've heard it called the Suicide Squad. And but several of them have actually reached out to talk, although the chief is nowhere to be found.
I think we get another question in. Zeba.
I have a question for you, the Failure to Protect story. I can see that it's such a compelling story where you have something so wrong that's happening with women who are abused, then further abused by the system, separated from their children, and then you have so much data to work with. Can you walk us through your process of writing it as a narrative arc, but then also merging data that you have, and how did you put it all together?
Good question. So we are still in the process of doing that, and it has certainly been a challenge. I would say that we've kind of been in communication the whole time. Like, I've been meeting with Ryan and kind of getting updates about, where he thought the data was headed, and kind of used that as like guideposts for writing the piece. But for the most part, I had some, basic data in the beginning before he started his project that the ACLU had done, some estimates about the fact that women of color were disproportionately sentenced. the fact that it's mostly women and not men who are being charged with these crimes. And so I kind of used that to write my early drafts. And then it's been in the later drafts that we've included some of Ryan's numbers.
Exactly. So it's taken a great deal of time to scrape, parse, investigate those parses. One of the hard things when working with a data set that you're creating in so many steps is the great finding that makes your hair stand up on your back could be the result of some dumb thing you did. And so every step of the process, you're always going back, looking to see if something you did is creating what you're seeing now, or if it really is the reality of those 1.5 million HTML files. I think ideally I would have been done a lot earlier than I have been, but when you're working in many projects, you get pulled in a lot of different ways. One of the things that has been really helpful for me in working with Sam is getting to read her narrative, because when I can read her narrative, it's a really easy way for me to understand what's important to her and what's important to that narrative. And I can say, ooh, I have this data. Ooh, I can tell you this thing, where she's referencing some other source, but I can go, oh, no, I could tell you this about Oklahoma. Or as what happened today when I was reading it again this morning before we had lunch, find a fourth website that we're now going to scrape. So, there's a lot of give and take, and I think a good relationship between sort of like the traditional reporter and the data reporter is just about listening, understanding what the goals are, and just keeping the lines of communication open as you understand what the story is becoming.
So I want to say thank you to our panelists. You don't applaud because they'll be back. But we're going to switch over now. We'll just take a brief 5-minute interlude, and if our other 4 panelists can find their way up. Hello. How are you?
Hello.
Hola.
Hello.
Hello.
Hola.
How, was it Privyet? Zdravstvuyte? I'm trying to remember all of my various hellos. That's Russian. Although we're not speaking Russian anymore these days. Ukrainian, right, exactly. I don't know how to say it in Ukrainian, but I will tell you an interesting thing that happened to me. Like, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a man of 1,000 anecdotes, which is that when I was taking Russian and I was practicing my Russian on anybody I could find, any poor, unwitting subject, there was a guy who was driving a taxi, and he said something, and I don't remember what it was, but it had like a Russian inflection to it. So I started using my elementary Russian. And he turned to me and said, "I am Ukrainian." And this was like 10 years ago. And he was like, I was like, but I in Russian had asked if he spoke Russian. And he responded in Russian, yes, he speaks Russian. And then I said something else, and then he said, "I am Ukrainian." And I was like, oops, awkward. Yeah, like, so in any case. I want to start, I guess, with the same questions, so we can kind of have a uniform approach to this. If we can start with Julieta and then kind of come back this way about how you approached the stories that you did, that you proposed for the Arnold Fellowship.
Yeah, so I'm still approaching. I'm still working.
Or
on
actually,
it.
not how you discovered or came upon the issue that you're working on.
Yeah, I think it's one of those like very journalistic things. It was like a random like seed that was planted by a conversation. I had been working, so I was living in Nashville at the time and working at a small public radio station. And I had spent 2 years profiling the case of a man who was released from prison and then ordered back. They basically said, we made a mistake. Oops, 2 years have gone by. You need to go back to prison for a decade. So I had spent, quite a long time working with him, and I was in and out. He had just gotten out, first person released as a result of the First Step Act. It was a really big story for us. And I was in an office, and I asked his lawyer, how do you do this? Because sometimes it gets really heavy, and, you get a win every once in a while. And he said, I'm going to go home, have a drink, enjoy this one win, and tomorrow I have 100 other cases. There's this guy, Edward Pinchon, who is a juvenile lifer, and I'm working on his case, and he was sexually abused. He killed his abuser when he was 16, and he's been in prison for 20 years. it was just a random mention. We moved on, but that stuck in my head. And so I started looking for funding, and I think it was 2017 actually. Couldn't do it, worked on a million other stories in between, but like my mind just kept going back to this. And so I just finished a big series about Suave, who is an incredible person, a juvenile lifer who was released after 33 years in prison. And this whole series is about, these changes in the criminal legal system and, 1,000 juvenile lifers who were released and have an opportunity to sort of, give back to their communities, start their life again. But to me, the series didn't feel complete, because the reality was I knew about this one place, right, Tennessee, which is special to me. I lived there, I worked there for a while. And I knew that our reporting was incomplete. Like, there was this one place where people were not getting out. Tennessee has 185 juveniles sentenced to life, and they have not been able to apply for relief after Miller or Montgomery, the laws that allowed 1,000 other juveniles to be released. It's kind of complicated, and we'll come back to it, but basically I've been trying to get this story done, and then I was able to finally get some funding, and so now I've been able to work on it, among other things, to go back to Tennessee and actually find those 185 people. But in the meantime, like, I'm learning that there's so much more than meets the eye, and that's because there's no transparency whatsoever in Tennessee.
Yeah. So I learned about my story the same time everybody else did in 2018. The Fort Bend Independent School District was building a new school in Sugar Land, Texas, which is about 20 miles outside of Houston. And they discovered some human remains. And anytime that happens, you have to pause construction, you have to investigate it. And they did that. And they found out that these remains belong to 95 mostly black men from the convict leasing era, which is this period of time after slavery ended until about 1914. So from 67, slavery ended in 63 technically. Texas found out in 65. Convict leasing happened in 67. So, there was a few years in between. But convict leasing started where it wasn't all black people, but it was, in Sugar Land specifically, predominantly black people who were leased out to private farms and made to do the work that slaves used to do. So you could be arrested for any kind of crime or no crime at all or a real crime and sent to prison. But instead of going to prison in Huntsville, which is where our prison is, you'd be sent out to a private farm. And these guys had a life expectancy of like 7 years, and most of them didn't make it that far. So when they found these bodies, that's when I learned about convict leasing for the first time. Despite living in Houston, or growing up in Houston and living in Texas my entire life, I had never heard of convict leasing, and it was this massive chapter in our history that was missing. And so when I heard about it, I was like, ooh, if we could find out who one of these guys are, like find a descendant, that's going to make an adorable little feature story, like it was like great feature fodder. When I started looking into it, nobody was coming forward to say, these are my ancestors. And to this day, nobody has really come forward to say, these are my ancestors. And it's been 4 years. So that's where our story was born. And when I started to really look into it, it became this whole other huge thing. So
it was interesting that we should have talked about this earlier, but it just popped into my head, that there are all these blues songs about that experience. And from August Wilson's play, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, song Berta Berta, which is in Alberta, which is about that. This song is a man singing, giving advice to the woman he left behind because he's been sent to Parchman Farm. But it's a huge portion of American history, American penal history, American labor history, that just as your project points to, like literally finds its way out of the grave into the present.
Yeah, Lomax, somebody Lomax. He did.
Alan Lomax.
Yes.
Yeah.
He did a whole series on prison songs and Ledbetter. Yes. He wrote Midnight Special, which actually mentioned Sugarland. Like, it's a whole thing. It was a very famous prison, terrible prison.
The means that people had at their disposal to communicate about what that experience was. Yeah. So, Margie and Robin, can I have you answer the same question?
Well, I think for us, you have to kind of go back in time with us, and that is both of us have spent most of our adult lives in Southeast Asia, in the developing world. And so, as you mentioned, we did slavery in the fishing industry. We did labor abuses and slavery and child labor in palm oil. And then we both kind of came back and, we kind of found ourselves almost foreigners in our own country because so much had changed in the, almost 20 years for me, and I think 20 plus years for her. This whole country had become a very different place. And so we, Robin had been working on a case in Minnesota, and I had been helping her from Indonesia on a guy's case. His name was Mayan Burrell, and he was jailed as a teenager in Minnesota, and there were a whole lot of problems with his case. And Amy Klobuchar, she was the main prosecutor there at the time, and she really used that case to help her career, pointing to how tough she was on crime. And so then we kind of picked through that case and found a lot of flaws, and it was really shocking, I think, for both of us. And eventually Mayan was released from prison, and then I came back, and this was really during the height of the pandemic. And we were doing stories at that point focusing on the virus and how it was affecting prison populations. And we all remember the prisons were being hit so hard, and they were still being made to go out and work. They were being made to go and work in very close proximity, making the hand sanitizers and the masks and everything. And so we started working on that. And I think at that point we became very interested in the state of this country's criminal justice system. And again, because we had been so immersed in the problems of these other countries, in particular Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, covering all these different things, we are learning, I think, every day. It's just sometimes mind-blowing to us that these things are happening here in this country where there's so much money and there's so much resources, and you see, well, we started looking again at the work that they were doing, and then we started looking at work release, and then we started listening, that ultimately led us back to the history, convict leasing, and you can't write about, I don't think, what's happening with the criminal justice system today unless you really understand the history. So we started immersing ourselves in that history, and I'll let Robin.
Right, I'll just go a little bit. When we left, I think, well, we both left at different times, but the prison population was around 700,000, and we came back and it had tripled. So a lot had changed, and a lot had also changed in terms of laws changing to allow people to work for private enterprises. I think a lot of people think of prison labor as just making license plates, or they have their idea of what it is, or more likely, prison uniforms or things that are going to go into the prison, but it really hasn't entered a market and has become a big part of significant part of the market. But I think with all our reporting, we, as most reporters, kind of let the reporting guide them, and we've switched directions a couple of times, and we've landed for the moment on convict leasing a bit, looking back to how did we get here. And that was really the time when you saw, before that it was mostly white prisoners, and then suddenly the population shift and you start seeing people working. And it's really when you start seeing that this is not about rehabilitation, this is about money. And that's what we're seeing again today. This is not about rehabilitation, it's about money. And the more people you have in there, And then also, you know, like you get out and you can't get a job and you can't get housing and you can't get food stamps and you can't, there's a revolving door that allows this to continue to grow. So we've been kind of, for the moment, we're looking really closely at the past convict leasing, how this began. And now we're looking specifically at work release and, you know, guys going out. I think when people think of work release, they think, okay, guy's got 6 months left. He's getting prepared to get back out into the real world. And he's learning a skill that is going to prepare him. Well, in some cases, let's see, Alabama is a good example. These guys, since this seems to be the topic of discussion, you know, these guys are not really work release. They are full-on inmates who are not going to get out sometime for 30 years, and they're out working in a poultry plant, you know, and that those numbers you see increase with the immigration policies changing and making it harder to find immigrants to work, the Trump you know, era thing, and also COVID. No one wants to work in these poultry plantations. So that's kind of like one example that we've been kind of focusing on. And then there's also just the county sheriffs, the parish sheriffs in Louisiana, where, you know, you get money to fill the beds. And if you look at the transitional workers in Louisiana, for instance, it's 85 pages of where these guys are going out to work, from McDonald's to like auto places, hotels. They're just part of the workforce and getting paid, but a huge percentage gets deducted. In Alabama, it's 40%. You're also paying for the prison vans. You go back and forth. You're also paying for your uniform. You know, so there's, by the end, you've got nothing and no skill. And Alabama is another. If we're going to stick with that. Some of the guys are doing it because they realize, okay, every 5 years I'm going to go before the parole board, and I'm going to have a chance to get out. Well, last year, I think 87% of the guys who went for the parole board in one county that we're looking at got denied. That was, you know, up from 40% just a couple years ago. So it's not even a ticket out or something that you can point to and say, okay, you know, like this is going to be good behavior. I'm kind of building a good reputation. It's pure work, really. So that's kind of where that's going.
I mean, I'm struck by something that Margie said at the beginning of her comments. Something that disturbs me is the frequency with which I've heard journalists who've spent significant amounts of time reporting abroad relaying that they've come back to the United States and been shocked at the extent to which the things that they covered abroad have become commonplace here. I was upstairs, as a matter of fact, literally when Ron Nixon came in, I was reading a manuscript by Luke Mogelson, my colleague at the New Yorker, who has spent a good deal of time abroad. He covered Afghanistan, covered Iraq, covered Ebola in West Africa, and talked about how problems that seemed to be particular to the societies that he was covering, the societies that had very big social problems, were indistinguishable from problems that he found when he covered the Michigan legislature, where all the armed militias came, you know, converged there, or January 6th, or any of these other things, and to see the almost seamless connection between the work that you did in Southeast Asia and the work that you're doing in the United States is chilling at the least.
Well, I'll just give one example on that. Like, one of the big issues for both the seafood project and the palm oil project we did was that these goods that were being produced through slave or forced labor were being sent to the United States. We were buying the goods, the fish, the palm oil. But in this case, we're seeing things that are produced by prison labor being sent overseas to China. You know, we're banning imports from China now, but it's produced by prison labor, but we are exporting it to China by our own prisons. So we're seeing so many parallels, and we saw them even when we were doing the reporting overseas. Like, this sounds like a lot like Reconstruction, like the way, but now we're seeing it from this end, and it's really, it's eerie.
The other thing that's really interesting too is I spent a lot of time on the palm oil project, going out to these, plantations and seeing all of this, kind of how it's run and how it's set up, and then of course, coming back here and looking at the prison system, and then again, really trying to immerse myself in the history, because I've read so many books, and I just don't think you can really understand. You can't understand anything unless you look back in time, because it's the past, and now we have the present, and there's so many parallels that if you understand that, you can see them so clearly. And we're just finding these threads all the time, and we'll call each other, and I'll say, "Oh my goodness, listen to this," or we'll be talking to somebody who like a public defender or somebody who's telling us stuff, and it's like, wow, this harkens back to this, and this is the same thing that we were seeing on the palm oil plantations with people. I mean, the dots are not, they all kind of connect in a strange way, and it's been really interesting. And I think in some ways for us, because we were gone for so long, we're kind of coming back with these fresh eyes in a way. I mean, obviously our families are still here and we came back here, but we lived, for a large chunk of our lives very, very far away in, we were caught up in the politics, and we were covering ethnic cleansing and all kind of other things, and not following things here as closely. So it's been really interesting.
I had a conversation with a student yesterday who is doing his thesis on the pine logging industry, and I hate to say it, in Alabama. And the way that the low property taxes there have basically enshrined inferior education for overwhelmingly black students in the Black Belt region. And we were trying to make the connections. I was talking about, kind of anchoring this, and Howard French, who is his advisor, was telling him, you have to get into the history, and I was saying the same thing. And I said, think of it, the relationship between these various forms or these various schemes as same make, new model. We're looking at a Chevy Mustang, it's a Ford Mustang. We're looking at a Ford Mustang, but maybe that's the 1990 model, and maybe this is the 2000 model, but we're still looking at the same make of vehicle over time. And there are place problems, to reiterate John's point. There are problems in many places beyond Alabama. I hate to even kind of say that, just because he just happened to be a student who was working on something in Alabama. But can we start with Robin and go in the other direction with the question about obstacles that you all confronted in reporting these stories, and how you navigated around them?
Well, I think the biggest obstacle at the moment is like Sam was saying, getting access to guys inside, whereas before COVID, it really surprised me how easy it was to talk to guys inside and to meet them face to face, with the even comms people were helpful. Now it's just nope, shut down, you can't. You can, it's starting to open up again, but that has kind of been a real, a little bit of an obstacle. I mean, it doesn't stop everything. We can still email and talk by phone, but in terms of expanding the network of people that we're talking to, that you don't have that kind of face-to-face relationship where people feel as comfortable introducing you to the other guys who are working, or so we're doing a little bit more who's already been out, and we can meet with them, and I don't know, it's just made it a little more difficult, I think, and a little bit, I guess, also when we're looking at the convict leasing, we're looking for descendants as well. That has been a huge obstacle. Yeah. And I think that, has taught us a lot about just genealogy and the difficulties for the African American community versus versus, the white community. You look up Ancestry.com we would have a lot of the answers right now if all these guys were white.
Oh, no doubt.
Right. So I think that's what I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, just dealing with the DOCs in general, like that's, I don't think, I don't know if COVID's makes that any harder or not, but they use COVID as an excuse, I think, now. But yeah, that's never easy. And yeah, and then, yeah.
Like, you can't type our names in without getting slavery, so it's like, why are you interested in prison labor? This is about slavery. Do you think this is slavery?
And you're like, kind of. Yeah.
At the risk of derailing this entire conversation, I will tell you all something that you can all verify later. If you Google the words angry black man, my picture comes up. It's a long story. Buy me a drink, I'll explain it to you one day. But it literally is true. Brittney?
Yes, definitely. I've spent a year doing this, and luckily we have like a very limited set of names that we're working with, so I'm not looking for like the descendants of everybody from convict leasing. I've got names, I've got rough ages and that kind of thing, which helps tremendously. But I've spent a year becoming an amateur genealogist, which is not something I ever thought I would do. And yeah, it's so frustrating because you enter a white person's name and immediately Ancestry is like tripping over itself, being like, oh, we've got 100 hints for you, like, come on, and the whole tree's filled out. And then you type in one black prisoner's name and it's like, oh no, he doesn't exist, I'm so sorry. So that's definitely a challenge, but because I've learned ancestry and genealogy through doing this work, I now don't really know how to do like my own. I try to look up my own family and I'm like, I don't know which documents to look at. Like, none of these, they're not in the slave schedules, they're not in all these things. So that's been a challenge, but it's also been really interesting. Just getting to archives during COVID has been difficult. Public libraries have been closed, state archives have been closed, and this information is not digitized, which is really frustrating. I still feel like there's probably a lot out there that I could learn that I just don't know that the information exists, so I can't read it. And then I think the biggest challenge is just doing it. I think it's really hard. I'm a print journalist. I have been for 10 years, and now I'm trying to make this podcast series. And I was explaining to Julieta earlier today, like, it's just trial and error. Like, I'm just listening to myself speak, and I'm listening to the tape I have and realizing how it's deficient or whatever after the fact. And so you're reporting and you're re-reporting and you're finding new characters that you need. And I'm just learning a lot. And so that's just hard to put everything together. And I hope that it eventually comes out one day.
I think a little background for it to make sense. So Tennessee's an outlier in terms of juvenile lifers because it actually went from being one of the most progressive states that actually still allowed juvenile life without parole to being the worst. So what happened was before 2012 when Miller happened, Tennessee's life sentence actually says after 51 years with good credit or 60 years, you have a built-in possibility for release. So that used to be progressive. Obviously that's changed. We have 25 states that have amended state laws. We have 10 states that have completely gotten rid of life without parole. So across the country, all states have sort of, started looking differently at how we deal with juvenile sentenced to life. Tennessee got stuck in the past. Tennessee has refused to amend state law, has refused to apply Miller or Montgomery to any of their cases, and the reasoning in state court is that there's actually already a built-in release date in their sentence. So the Supreme Court decisions don't apply. What we do know, when I started this project, what I knew was that there were 185 lifers, and I knew that the Tennessee law was sort of changed in 1995, and that's where the number came from. There is no data before 1995. I have yet to find a single person, anything, so I'm without these skills, one by one, going through court records, county by county, by myself and just trying to identify other cases before 1995. I believe that there's a lot more, but I'm working on it. The other challenge is, so Tennessee, it's always challenging, right, to work with people that are incarcerated. I've been doing that for over a decade, but Tennessee's the worst. You are not allowed to go in to interview someone, well, maybe not Alabama, but you are not allowed to go in and interview an incarcerated person as a member of the media. It's completely forbidden. You also are not allowed to do phone interviews. So if you get caught, you can get in a lot of trouble. So the way that I kind of went around it when I lived in Tennessee was like, these are informal conversations with my friends, right? Like, this is my incarcerated friend, and we're gonna talk about this issue. It worked for a while. The problem is that before I left Nashville, I did this like big investigation into a district attorney's office that sort of forced them to admit that their conviction review unit was not doing anything, and then we got a man to be released. He was wrongfully convicted. It was a big deal in the state. So my sort of unknown underdog thing that had worked for me for a while put me in the radar of some of these folks. I did a lot of stories that were very negative about the Department of Corrections, about racism in the police departments. I used to look out of my window in my apartment and there would be police cars parked outside, and they did that for about a year until I left. So coming back now is challenging because anytime my name pops up, it's like an immediate denial. Like, they don't even wait 6 months to tell me they're denying my visit or my request or whatever it is. It's like, it's instant. Tennessee also has awful FOIA laws. So like, you must be a citizen of Tennessee. You must have a driver's license or an ID with a Tennessee address, which means that I can't do my own record requests. So oh, there you go. So I have, former colleagues and people who are kind to me who have been submitting my record requests, but then they catch on, they know that it's for you, and so then it becomes an issue. So I'm kind of, it's been a slow process. It's really a lot of like talking to people. For example, some of the folks that I used to write about who were incarcerated for a long time have connected me to people that they knew when they were incarcerated who are lifers, who are then connecting me to juvenile lifers. And so it's a very slow and sort of complicated process. Building trust, as you know, takes a lot of time. So it's been difficult in terms of like receiving records, but also being able to talk to the people that I need to talk to. And then the last thing I think is like, we know, for example, from the NAACP has a wonderful set of data which is like what kind of like started the story for me. NAACP was able to find that 17% of the citizens in Tennessee are Black, but 80% of incarcerated people are Black, and in counties like Shelby County, 100% of the juvenile lifers are Black. So I know that this is an issue of racism, right? The problem is that I need to know how many people actually committed the same crimes and were tried as juveniles. But it's impossible to know that because those records are sealed. So what I have to work with is, there's 250 cases, 185 of them were convicted to life. That's inaccurate. I know that that's not accurate information, but the juvenile court system is not granting me access to any of the data that I need. So my hunch is that the majority of white children that are convicted or that are charged with murder are being tried as juveniles, and that's why their records are sealed, and that this large number of Black children are being charged as adults. That's my current hypothesis, but it's been a very slow and difficult process. And so I'm a big believer that, like, I love and I appreciate data, but I think like first person information is just as important and qualified. And so I'm, speaking to as many incarcerated men and women as I can and learning from them. How many people in your unit are juvenile lifers? Like, okay, what about this person? Can you put me in contact in pod D? All right, let me talk to this person in pod D. How many people in your unit are juvenile lifers or were convicted of this or whatever it might be? So it's kind of a trial and error situation for me. It's pretty challenging. I am sort of working on this one alone amongst other projects. But I feel like we've definitely made some progress.
And last question I have before we actually, we'll see if we can succinctly get through this one about the responses that you all have received from your reporting thus far. I know, recognizing that everyone's at different points in their work. I guess we'll start with Robin and go back that way.
We've gotten no response, but we haven't published anything either.
Same, because I also haven't published anything. I think that it helps that the story in Sugarland has been told by several media outlets, but not to the extent, like not completely. So the coverage that it's received has been very surface level, and the school district, who did build their school on this gravesite, they've been managing the narrative in a way that makes them look like they've done the right thing. And depending on who you ask, they have done the right thing. They've followed all the laws. They think that they are being respectful. I just talked to the superintendent last week, and he was like, yeah, I'm really happy with what we did. I'm really happy with the choices we made. So it's only when you dig in a little bit deeper that you see it wasn't really, you're not telling the whole story, and you're further erasing this history by telling the story that you are telling. So I think when the story comes out, it will get some response. But right now, everybody's willing to talk about it because they think everybody, no matter who you talk to, thinks that they've done the best thing they could possibly do.
Yeah, no, same for me. I think the feedback that that matters to me maybe the most is the people that I've been talking to. There's a lot of people who, you're incarcerated 30, 40 years. You go in as a 14-year-old. Parents pass away, grandparents pass away. People I've talked to who have said, like, you're the only person I've like communicated with in like 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. Like nobody cares. Like nobody, like I got locked up and that was it. So for me, I think that has done a lot for my heart and my motivation as it's gotten more and more complicated. And just, the fact that that they feel like I want them to be able to tell their own stories, that's really important. And so just knowing that people are happy to talk to you and to tell their stories, I think has been really, really encouraging for me.
Okay, so we have time for questions. You can ask questions of our current panelists or of the first set of panelists. I do have to request that you use the microphone in the back because otherwise your question will likely not get picked up on the recording we're doing. Oh, and if it's one of the people in the, from the first panel, I will bring the microphone over to you to make sure we get your answer too.
Good. Hi, thank you for sharing these reporting experiences. They've been incredible. One thing that really struck me when I moved to this country last year is how predatory and counterproductive the criminal justice system can be, and there seems to be this entire economy that exists around locking people up or fining people. And people talk a lot about recidivism rates and bringing that down, yet it's really, really hard to be a formerly incarcerated person in this country. So I was curious to know, have you had a sort of outrageous response to your reporting on these issues, or does there seem to be a general lack of empathy amongst people in this country?
And who was your question for? Was it for this?
Anyone that wants to jump in.
I remember early on in my reporting, I was a State House reporter, and I was doing a story about the fact that there aren't air conditioning units in most of Texas prisons, which is insane. You cannot live without air conditioning in Texas. Don't try. You'll die. So a lot of people do die, and it's just from overheating. And there's been so many investigations and so many lawsuits where prisoners join with employees and guards and wardens, and everybody's saying, please, God, give us air conditioning because everybody's dying. And I remember going to, writing a story about this, and going to the guy who's like in charge of he was a state senator who was in charge of the Committee on Criminal Justice, and he's known as like a very progressive liberal. He's been in the State House forever. I remember being like, what's going on? Why can't we get this fixed? Why aren't we investing in this? thinking he would say, yeah, it's wrong. Why doesn't anybody care? And instead he said, because they're prisoners. Nobody cares about them. What are we going to spend money on prisoners? No, these people aren't worth it. And I was like, you're supposed to be the progressive voice, though. Like, this isn't. So I was really surprised that that it seems like people feel this way. People don't see the humanity in incarcerated people across the spectrum. It's not a liberal or conservative issue. It is, they're stripped of their humanity when they go in, and they don't get it back even when they come out. So yeah, I want to add, I have a what I call the wall of hate. It's really mind-blowing, but I do get a lot of, or I've gotten in the past, you know, like, you're defending murderers, you know, wish that would happen to you, for you to understand. You know, last year my brother-in-law was murdered, in the middle, by a juvenile, as I'm working on this piece. And I think, like, for me, it's led to a lot of soul searching, but it hasn't at all affected the way that I feel about the work. And I think sometimes people make assumptions, right? Like, I've been pretty open about having been undocumented most of my life, and I built a career reporting on immigration. And so I've been accused of that many times. It doesn't really faze me. But I think, like, there is this, as Brittney mentioned, like this general belief that because you believe in the humanity of all people, or because you believe in the right to access to justice, that you somehow are not affected by these things. We're all affected by this, and yeah, I think it can be really challenging. But I've made a fun thing out of it, so now I just kind of enjoy getting the hate mail, and I'm like, okay, that means I'm doing my job, and that's a good way for me to look at it.
First of all, when y'all came back to America, what you discovered was the Alabamification of America, as our colleague called it. But I mean, you know, the thing about it is when you write about the things really you guys have all been talking about, whether it's Alabama's refusal to let people out on parole, or, you know, slavery turned to convict lease system, turned to whatever else, to privatize prisons, to whatever else can profit off of people. When you tell it in the context of these people who are, you know, really suffering, you're right, people write them off and don't want to hear. And it's a real challenge to get resonance in talking about the people who need help the most, and who, because they're written off. And that's why, I mean, again, writing about something as stupid as a speed trap that seems to put people in a position of understanding those bigger realities seems to me to be so eye-opening, because it seems like a dumb thing that everybody just takes for granted, but all of a sudden they see and can relate to the injustice that's happening to people. People are being criminalized for no reason, and they're being criminalized in order for people and governments to profit, which is the bottom line to everything we've been talking about up here throughout history. And so I think finding those ways that can make people relate to these issues is really just our prime directive on this. And, you know, and I love how you guys work, and it's just, I mean, you know, that's what we got to do.
Other questions?
I will say real quick. Oh, no, you want to go ahead?
I'll just say, on the same token, like when I first came back and started writing about the prison in Minnesota, the immediate reaction is, everybody lies. Like, all those guys are liars. When we're in Asia, no one was saying that about the Uyghurs. You know, like, everything they say is a lie, or the Rohingya, or what? Well, they do. There is some lying going on, but but the point is, I mean, even family and friends were like, don't trust them. They're, you know, and it just kind of kills me.
I was going to say, when I've been pitching this story to different people, I get a lot of, we don't want to do a history podcast right now. And I have to keep saying, yes, it's about history, but it's so important, because unless you understand this history, how are you supposed to sympathize with what's happening today. And everybody's like, well, it's not a life or death issue. All these people are dead. Why do you care about them? And it's like, because it explains everything. You can't, I think if you want to understand institutional racism, you just have to look at this situation that happened in Sugar Land. Like, we suddenly couldn't have slavery, so we found another way. And the fact that you can just see it waves upon wave upon wave. And as soon as you can see that, the patterns in history, you can actually expect more of people. You can say, hey, you understand this now, so let's ask you to go a step further and do X, Y, and Z. Like, but until you know that, which we don't know. I grew up in Texas. I had never heard of convict leasing before. I didn't know the ramifications of the 13th Amendment. I didn't know all this stuff. And now knowing it, it's all I can see is patterns. And so, yeah.
Well, you even look at like how many people were dying of illnesses or overwork, and in the prisons, how many people are just like, their medical conditions are completely ignored or neglected. They have doctors that cannot work anywhere else, but like the worst doctors going to the prisons.
Oh my God, yeah.
Or
been
kicked out and bounced around, and they're just like, or with workman's comp, like you get injured on the job, you don't get workman's comp if you're on work release in a lot of places, or if you do, you're going to the company doctor, and so it's kind of that same. Those convicts in convict leasing were no longer property, so their lives were less valuable.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. One of my mentors in graduate school was a historian by the name of David Oshinsky, who we talked about. Yeah, and he wrote a book called Worse Than Slavery. And one of the first things that came up was that, and his book is about Mississippi, but people who had been enslaved were often incarcerated on the same plantations, but they had been enslaved. And the difference being that a slave has value, has monetary value. A person who's incarcerated does not. And so they would use people for labor that they would never dream of using a slave for. And that was, work them to death, yeah. Like one of the things that happened in Florida was draining swamps, which people would never have allowed, a person whose value in 1850 was $1,200 or $1,800, which is a lot of money. They would never allow them to do that kind of work. But that was very commonplace with the convict lease system. I want to get one more question in before we wrap up. Yeah, Jaden.
Greetings. Yeah, one quick question. I've been thinking about this really this entire school year, and I've noticed one trend that you all have obviously is the luxury of time. Being able to work on these things with the funding that you all have and whatnot. And I think a big fear of I know a lot of us in the J School we talk about is this fear of when you're on the daily grind, right, and you don't have that time to really have that kind of rigor that you all are applying to what you're doing. I'm curious, suggestions and comments that you all have on tackling that, to avoid, contributing to those harmful narratives that, there isn't any kind of previous, precedent set with these big things that have strong connections to history and racism, et cetera.
Sorry. I feel very strongly about this.
We all feel like really strong.
This is probably terrible advice, but the biggest stories that I've done, the stories that have brought the most change in my career, I've done at night and on the weekends because I was not given the time in the newsroom because I was a daily reporter. Mr. Charles got out of prison. That mostly happened working till 3 a.m. and working on weekends. The wrongful conviction story that I did, I worked on for 3 years. I got paid $350 as a freelancer. I always bring that up. I got a $350 check after 3 years of work. Wow. But Mr. Webster got out of prison, so that was more than enough payment. I do think it is a real problem. It is a real problem. I do think, I feel very privileged because I am in a position now where, I do have a little bit more time, but I'm working on 5 series at the same time right now. And so I work in a tiny newsroom. We're a nonprofit. And so if you're passionate about a story and you don't want to drop it, I think, what I've learned, at least for me, is to be patient Did I want those stories to take 3 years? No. Would I have loved to have been able to dedicate 6 months straight and knock it out? Yes, that would have been amazing. But the same thing with this piece that I'm working on now. It took me almost 5 years to get funding for it, to be able to be like, okay, I can start setting time aside now. And, you know, my job has to let me set time aside and go work on it. So I'm a big believer in, like, if you really, like, if you believe in this story, like, even if it takes a long time, like, do not let go, because sometimes, like, it feels so urgent, and it is urgent, particularly when we're dealing with, like, incarcerated people or people that are suffering human rights abuses. But it's better to work on it a little bit at a time than to not work on it at all, and that's what's kind of gotten me through. I wish it wasn't that way. That's why I'm saying this is probably terrible advice, but I still work until 1 or 2 in the morning on stories that I care about, because I don't have time during the workday.
Yeah, I think that we all, I think I'm probably speaking, we're all speaking for everybody here. Like, these are like our little, for years, you know, I mean, now we have our esteemed editor, Ron Nixon, here, who rescued me and Robin from the daily grind work. But I mean, for most, well, yes, and but I mean, for years and years and years, we were running around, you know, like in charge of an entire country with like 240 million people, or running around in a region where there were terrorist attacks and tsunamis and, you know, ethnic cleansing, and you were just going from one story, plane crashes, and then we had on the side our, you know, passion projects, which were, you know, the bigger things. And so, you know, you keep those things on the side, and maybe you don't tell your editor you're working on it, because then, you know, they'll try to maybe push you away from it. But then when you get, or they want it, or somebody else will take it. So then you wait until you get a really juicy kernel, and then you go and you say, I've been working on this thing, and look what I've got. And then it's really hard, right, Ron? It's really hard at that point to say no.
Yeah, if the story's good enough, eventually, hopefully, you'll be able to tell it. But yeah, I think all of us feel extremely privileged to be able to tell these stories, and it's so, so, so hard. Like, I'm an independent journalist, and if I don't work for a few months, like, I don't have any income at all, and that's really scary. So I couldn't do this until I was getting substantial money, like grants from the Lipman Center, to support it. Like, I couldn't just do it and not eat for a year. Like, that doesn't work. And, you know, I think you just have to keep proving yourself over and over and over again and developing that story idea. And it was not until it was a really fleshed out idea and really compelling narrative that nobody could deny that this was a story worth telling that I actually got the support to do it. And I'm still looking for support to do it. I mean, it's so big and so ambitious that I still have, you know, reporting needs. I'm trying to get those met. But I know the story's so good that it'll all happen, hopefully, maybe. Journalism's a weird industry.
I was going to say to Jane about that question, like, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is exactly what our thinking was around, you know, a whole array of the things we do with Lipman, and trying to help in circumstances where even with people who, when we first started this, I think we thought we would get like freelancers, like that was going to be the main group of people applying. And then we realized, you know, that a lot of times we would get people who were with publications, but it still wasn't necessarily feasible for them to do the story that they wanted to do. And so that is what we have been trying to do with both our Lipman fellowships, which will be announced tomorrow. Our next group, is tomorrow, the day after tomorrow? Oh no, actually on Monday. Yeah, Monday. All right, yeah. Sorry, I'm jumping the gun there. Should I just tell people who they are? But no, on Monday we're going to announce our next group of fellows, and we're very much looking forward to our next set of Arnold grant recipients too, because we want to keep doing more of this. And so you have the last question of the night.
Actually, I just wanted to offer a solution to the last question. As much as everybody, you know, wants the best job they can get when they get out of school, shift work has its benefits. working the night shift, volunteering for the weekends, volunteering on holidays. I did a lot of that when I was young because I worked at the AP. And there's downtime there in those shifts and on the overnight, on Christmas. I always worked Christmas because I didn't actually like going to my family's at Christmas. But in Alabama,
there's a big club here. Let me tell you.
But in those crevices, I found time to work on Enterprise at an early stage in my career. And yeah, it's paying a price when you're working 2 to 10, or you're working on Saturdays and Sundays when your friends are off, but maybe you volunteer to work a Sunday to Thursday every week. And so you have every Sunday, and yeah, sometimes you're gonna have a story, but sometimes you're not gonna have a story on Sunday. Or sometimes you're gonna be able to whip it out in 3 hours, and then you've got 5 hours to work on your baby. So think about those jobs and don't always try to get the Monday through Friday 9 to 6, because then you are under your editor's nose and always going to be doing the breaking stuff.
And sure. This is Ron Nixon, right? Mm-hmm. Wait till you get to the microphone. Okay.
Hi. This is something that comes up often about, like, particularly for young journalists, and you're going into the industry, and you get this thing about you have to pay your dues, right? And you've got to go work. And anybody from Fargo, North Dakota? Okay, got to go to Fargo or someplace like that, right? Yeah, go to Fargo or someplace. That is not the case anymore, right? Because one, there are leaders in the industry now who understand that because we went through hell doesn't mean that you have to go through hell. And then two, there are publications that will hire people that they would not hire. And we were at the New York Times, and there are people that are hired at the New York Times now. I look at and I'm like, whoa! Like, it took me. I think I was like in my 30s, late 30s or 40s before I got to the New York Times. We have a veteran investigative team at the AP, but I just hired a young lady just out of college because she's good. And I'm like, why do I need to make her wait till she's seasoned to come and work for us? So, yeah, we got people like Margie and Robin and others who work there, but I don't need to make somebody wait to feel like they've earned their place. She's earned her place here. So things are changing, and I don't think that it is necessary that you have to do the things that we had to do. I was telling Dolores last night that my first job, we had to grab the check and run to the bank because there may not be any money when you got, and a lot of weeks there wasn't anybody. You just had a check. This is why I discovered payday lenders, because you could go and take the check there and they wouldn't touch it for 2 weeks. So you build a little tough. Actually, it was in South Carolina, but so strange. Born in Alabama. Okay. All right.
Okay. On that note, I was trying to kind of find a great. Well, you know what? I'm having a family reunion. I'm going back to see all my Alabama relatives. I have never, ever been to Alabama without having incredibly good food. Despite all the other problems there, I have the kindest, most decent, and some of the warmest people I know. And also, my mother's home, unfortunately, my mother's home was obliterated in those tornadoes that struck in 2010 just outside of Birmingham. And that community, when we went back to try to find out what was going on and what we needed to do, that community, there were people who had already gone and salvaged to find the things they could find, and my mother's neighbors, to find the things they could find that were still useful in my mother's home. And this is before I could even get there from New York. And so I just want to end on a note of saying of my many positive experiences with the state of Alabama. And I also want to say, our gratitude for everyone who came from out of town to participate in this. So Thank you to John and Ashley and Ryan and Samantha and Julieta, who, wait, are you in Tennessee or you're local?
Atlanta.
You're in Atlanta? How did we get Atlanta?
I lived in Harlem, and then I moved to Atlanta during the pandemic.
Oh, okay, right, because I was like, I know where Futuro is. Yeah, not in Atlanta. And Brittney and Margie and Robin. And so thank you all, and of course, special acknowledgement to Dolores Barkley, who makes the Lipman Center work. So thank you. There's food and there's some beverages in the back, and take it off our hands, please. All right, have a good evening.